Welcome back to The Fix. Of course, tonight's big hitter, former President Kgalema Motlanthe. Now, President Motlanthe, or former President Motlanthe, you have, of course, served in various capacities post your exit from government. One in which you served was, of course, the High Panel on the issue of land. Very emotive, very central to how one grows the economy. One of the papers had you saying, let's leave the chiefs, let's choose the people. And of course, this created the impression that the ANC is not going to be necessarily so concerned with the questions around traditional forms of government and the way in which they exercise leadership. I want us to quickly just listen to the Zulu King Goodwill Zwelithini speak about his feelings on the matter, and then we can take the issue further around how land is going to help us build an inclusive economy.
Futhi siyamangala uma sekukhona abahleba laphana endlebeni ye-ANC njengoba sifundile nje kwiphephandaba leli bayede yanamuhla ukuthi kukhona sebethi i-ANC ayiziqhelelanise nobukhosi. Laba bantu bathi asiyeke ukusebenza okuhle okunjengalokho esizokubungaza namuhla. Bathi umeni kasemuke umhlaba njengoba ngendlela yokusithukuluza lokho ngoba ngendlela engibuka ngayo mina. Kulabo ngithi cha abangasoli ubudlelwano bethu ngoba akekho yozuza uma ngase kusuke eyombhedukazwe. Kuyoba kuba sekufuni lokho ngoba siyazi abantu abalwayo kukhona abafawu ndawo zonke. Asiyimiseleke thina ngoba omkhulu bethu bayayazi yiphi. Njengoba silapha nje siphuma womkhulu ababe ngesabi lutho. Ngakho-ke ngithi kinina njengabantu bakababa asiguqiseni thina esiyi-forefront yokuniphatha ohlangothini lobukhosi, ohlangothini lukahulumeni.
That's, of course, King Goodwill Zwelithini speaking there on the question. Welcome back to The Fix. I'm Karima Brown. Let's get straight to it as I continue the conversation with former President Kgalema Motlanthe. Now, the tension, and I'm putting it in inverted commas, between the African National Congress and traditional leaders so close to a general election is, of course, a risky move. But many have argued that it is actually the people, as you correctly said, that needs to be courted and not the traditional leaders. How are you going to manage this balancing act?
Well, Karima, it's important to get context because many commentators lift one statement out of context. The issue really here was that the ANC had been lobbied by traditional leaders.
Right.
That should the land be transferred and be given back to the people, that should be given to traditional leaders. They will hold it on behalf of their subjects, as they say. And having listened to many people who live within the jurisdiction of traditional leaders, the view I hold is that land security of tenure must be extended to people who are farm dwellers, labor tenants on the farms, as well as those who live under the jurisdiction of traditional leaders.
What exactly do you mean?
And that does not mean that traditional leaders would not get land. They would get their portion of the land. But each and every household must be also given security of tenure in law, in legislation.
Even those who live under the auspices of traditional leadership.
That's right.
Now, I happen to
That's
agree
right.
with you for the following reasons. We know, of course, who a traditional leader is in South Africa is a question of debate and contestation because of the history of colonialism. But the other thing we often forget is that 60% of our people live in urban areas. A lot of them don't live in formal homes.
Yeah.
So even if you give them a title deed, what do you do to the person who lives in Orange Farm, who doesn't have a structure that is called a home? How does that person access land?
Well, the issue of the land reform, restitution, and redistribution is layered and complex. For those who live in urban areas, in the townships, the land has been surveyed and demarcated. They must be issued with title deeds forthwith,
Right.
without any delay. The second point to be made here is that you cannot have urbanization which is led by squatting, and the authorities then tail behind,
Right.
and formalize squatting. We must have a program which seeks to provide people in urban areas, because demand for land is actually in urban areas, not in rural areas, so that they can be settled in properly surveyed and demarcated properties. And they must also be given security of tenure, because the majority of them do not have
In fact,
that security.
Absolutely. Now, of course, we're talking about this because it's an important issue, it's an
Yeah.
unresolved issue, but it's also tied to how inclusive our economy, in fact, is.
That's right.
And more importantly, what kind of message we send out to investors. Now, the president, for example, among other ministers and among other members of the executive, have often said that foreign investors actually understand that South Africans must have a stake in their land for the country to be sustainable. It's domestic investors that are nervous, that believe that, it's going to end up in a land grab, and that the economy, particularly things like food security and agriculture, is going to be very badly affected. Is this a myth that if we settle the question of land justice, particularly in urban areas, that we will be destroying our economy?
Yes, it's a myth. It is a myth. Actually, it would be enhancing our economy, because you'd have more people who would have an asset. Because once they hold title is a commercial instrument.
They are invested.
They will be able to participate as people who have an asset
Right.
at their disposal. Yes.
Now, you are gathering some really interesting people at this forum of yours, where you're going to be looking at inclusive growth. We've already spoken about all these young people that need to be brought in. We've spoken about the fourth industrial revolution. Now, when I look at ANC policy documents, and even the policy documents of other political parties, there is very little understanding of the extent of the disruption of this industrial revolution, where artificial intelligence, for example, will be wiping out jobs, where you're going to have automated cars. Does the government of the day, and more importantly, all the other social players, the trade unions, the business communities, and even South Africans, do they fully understand and grasp the impact that this fourth industrial revolution is going to have on the very notion of how we understand what a job is and what work constitutes?
Well, we are hoping that the ideas that would be able to generate at this forum could be lifted by people in the private sector as well as in the public sector, and practicalized, because indeed we are also, as a foundation, working with the young people.
Yes.
Who are very innovative. For instance, who have blockchain technology, and which can go a long way in eliminating the problems that forever been exposed by the Auditor General of municipalities that
Yes.
are unable to balance their books. Blockchain technology would help them to eliminate that problem altogether.
Now, if one talks about the use of technology to, one, get proper governance, because you'd be able to have corrective measures.
That's right.
2, you'd be able to bring young people in. You then need a political leadership that is, of course, willing and able. This struggle in the African National Congress, but also even across society, for a better generational mix is a real struggle. Young people feel very, very left out. This is the month of June. It's the 42nd anniversary of June 16th. How do we bring these young people in? The ones that have skills, the ones that don't have skills. The truth of the matter is they're the demographic that is going to be the future.
Yes, well, the first step is to hear them out. That, you know, they have ideas. Remember, they don't only have concerns and complaints, but they have ideas and suggestions as well, which have to be heard by those in authority. That's why we must convince those in authority to create an environment in which the vocabulary used by young people can be embraced.
You know, I like what you're saying, because it's a very big challenge. If one looks at your own organization, where you've spent the majority of your life in, everyone in the top 6 is over 50. In fact, I would say over 55. In some instances, perhaps even over 60. The demographic that's going to matter is under 35. There's a disconnect. Is the African National Congress able to actually have the language to engage with young people?
Well, if we draw the right lessons from history, Walter Sisulu was in his 30s when he became Secretary General of the ANC. Oliver Tambo, when he became a member of the National Executive Committee, was in his 30s. So if we are drawing the right lessons from the history of the ANC, many of the prominent leaders ascended positions of responsibility, of leadership, when they were in their 30s, which is a matured age.
Now, of course, when one looks at the historical kind of kingmakers in the African National Congress, it used to be your youth leagues, right? It's not necessarily the case at the moment. We have the phenomena of what we call provincial barons as we speak, but that also has a young people element to it. But young people in the African National Congress haven't always spoken the language of progress. Some of them have sucked at the teat of patronage. They have been some of its enablers and some of its worst, supporters. How do we get a group of young people, not just interested in politics, but also in business, in the community, in innovation? How does the Motlanthe Foundation reach out to these people via the idea of building this inclusive economy? Let's start with the African National Congress, for example.
Well, the African National Congress is a political organization. It has a youth league, and the constitution of the ANC specifically emphasizes the fact that the ANC Youth League is an integral part of the ANC structures, but it is autonomous. The reason why it has to be autonomous is because it's got to bring radical perspectives into the ANC.
But radical doesn't always equal good or progress, does it?
Well, radical in its fundamental sense.
Or in its proper sense.
In its proper sense. Not reckless, but radical, progressively so. In other words, to bring new ideas, to question the underpinnings of, what is in place. Because if we say, as it was, so shall it be, it's a barrier to progress.
Now, Mr. Motlanthe, you've been very, very harsh in your critique, of course, of the political processes in your own organization, but also just in society in general, the way in which the state has functioned and operated and so on. We have now got a process of reform, a process of clean up. And of course, this is tied to the confidence that people have in the administration's ability to grow the economy. Do you think President Ramaphosa is moving fast enough and instilling instilling that confidence, particularly when you have your GDP figures that you've had, when you have a situation where S&P says, well, actually, we're not quite, yet convinced that South Africa has turned the corner?
Well, we're not out of the woods yet, but, there's lots of goodwill. And South Africans of goodwill have got to answer the call that, all of us must do our bit to try and literally lift the economy and our country with its own bootstraps, so to speak. And so the leadership of President Ramaphosa is going to be supported because he needs that support. He needs to be assured that the people, broadly speaking, are behind him. Of course, he needs to also understand that, as head of state, you're president of all South Africans.
Right.
And therefore, as I said earlier on, in strengthening the state, we must call on the best available talent in the country.
That's a really interesting point that you're making. You're saying call upon the best available talent. Now, we had two situations where in eThekwini, the Auditor General's staff came under threat because they wanted to understand how the public purse was being managed in that, a municipality. I want to get your comment on that. And then the second was, of course, the fact that Floyd Shivambu raised in Parliament what many saw as a racist attack against someone who's been in the Treasury, the kind of person that you were describing, Ishmael Mamoniat, a professional, someone with a track record of justice, but also someone with a track record of good governance, as someone who's undermining African leadership. Let's start with the last one. How do we deal with that kind of an attack on civil servants that have, in fact, listened to the president and taken up his call to serve? And how do we deal with Mr. Shivambu, who says that that constitutes an undermining of African leadership?
Well, he said that within the confines of Parliament, and I watched an interview with ENCA in which he specifically emphasized the fact that he cannot be asked to account because he is protected to say whatever in whatever manner within the confines of Parliament. That is why when parliamentarians issue statements that are unparliamentary, the offended party would say, please repeat this outside of this building.
Now, of course, you have a lot of time for young people. You say we must listen to them. People like Mr. Shivambu and them are young. They have put radical ideas on the table, but they've also made these kinds of allegations. Is it important in your view that Mr. Shivambu actually has the courage of his convictions to repeat this outside of Parliament?
I doubt that. I doubt that he would have the courage to repeat it outside of Parliament.
Why do you think so?
The manner in which he harped on the protection he enjoys inside the House, I think, in a way, said it all. Because I am sure that there's a motive for this, generous attack is leveled on Momoniat. I'm sure there's a reason for it.
Do you think it's justified?
No, it cannot be justified. You cannot attack someone for standing ready to do his or her duty as delegated by the department. Remember, Treasury is headed by a minister who's an African, a deputy minister, and the DG. And so the assumption is that Momoniat is not, popping up everywhere. He's doing what he is asked to do by the leadership. at Treasury.
Well, as I said to you before we came to the studio, the time flies when you're having a good conversation. Thank you so very much,
you. Thank you,
former
Karima.
President Kgalema Motlanthe, of course, joining us here on The Fix. Still ahead, we'll have a panel of commentators who will prepare us for what you'll all be talking about in the coming week.